He walked out of jail on a weekend pass like it was just another Friday. Calm, quiet, smiling. And when he returned 3 days later, nobody suspected a thing. But in those 72 hours, 3 people were dead. 2 of them were children. In today's episode of Death Row Diaries, we uncover the deeply disturbing case of Byron Lewis Black, a man with a violent past, a twisted love triangle, and a secret he thought he could bury. We'll take you inside the crime, the cover-up, the trial, and eventually the prison walls where Byron would spend the rest of his life. And at the end of this video, we'll reveal his final moments, his last meal, and the strange detail about his execution that sparked an ethical debate. Welcome to Death Row Diaries. If you're fascinated by true crime stories that go beyond the headlines, stories filled with twists, questions, and consequences, then you're in the right place. Subscribe now and hit that bell icon because we're just getting started. Now, let's dive into the chilling case of Byron Lewis Black, a man whose final breath came 35 years after his most unforgivable crime. It was Friday, March 25, 1988. Byron Lewis Black, a 32-year-old inmate at the Metropolitan Nashville-Davidson County Detention Facility, walked out of jail on a weekend furlough. That meant he was granted permission to leave jail from Friday evening until Monday, unsupervised. It was a program designed to help inmates transition back into society. But in Byron's case, it was a catastrophic mistake. At exactly 5:30 p.m., he stepped out of the workhouse gates and vanished into the weekend. And when he returned on Monday evening, just after 5 p.m., he acted as if nothing had happened. He was calm, quiet, smiling. But everything had happened. That weekend, 3 people were dead. 3 lives gone in one night. The bodies hadn't been discovered yet, so no alarms were raised, no red flags, no panic. Byron slipped back into jail like a man returning from a picnic, but what he was really returning from was a massacre. Let's rewind the clock and look at who the victims were. The first was Angela Clay. She had just finished another exhausting shift at Vanderbilt Hospital, where she worked as a nurse. She clocked out at 10 p.m. on Sunday night and was picked up outside by her sister, Lynette Bell. Lynette had borrowed Angela's car that weekend and had agreed to drive her home. But Lynette wasn't alone. Sitting in the passenger seat was Byron Black, Angela's on-again, off-again boyfriend. The 3 drove together to the house of Amelia Bell, which was Angela and Lynette's mother. They visited briefly, chatted, laughed. Angela dropped off her daughters, 9-year-old Latoya and 6-year-old Lakeisha, and promised to return an iron she borrowed the next day. It was a normal evening. But she never returned that iron, because just a few hours later, when the apartment went quiet and her daughters fell asleep, Byron came back. And this time, he didn't knock. To understand how this story spiraled into murder, you need to understand Byron's relationship with Angela. And it wasn't just complicated, it was dangerous. Angela had been previously married to a man named Benny Clay. They had 2 daughters together, Latoya and Lakeisha. And though their marriage had ended, there was still something there, a bond, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, they could patch things up. But that wasn't going to happen, not with Byron Black in the picture. Angela had started seeing Byron shortly after the separation, but it wasn't clean. Some weeks she was still seeing both men. Benny didn't like it. He made that very clear. And Byron, he wasn't backing down. He wanted Angela for himself, and he made it known, if I can't have you, nobody will. Those weren't just words. They were a threat. And it wouldn't be long before Byron turned that threat into action. In December 1986, Byron and Benny crossed paths. It started with a screaming match, then fists clenched. Then Benny tried to walk away, but Byron wasn't finished. He pulled out a gun, shot one, hit Benny's car. Shot two, tore through his foot. Shot three, smashed into his shoulder and lodged near his collarbone. Benny collapsed in the street, bleeding. Byron stood over him, gun still raised, ready to finish the job. But that's when Angela stepped in. She shoved Byron back, screaming at him to stop. Somehow he did, and shortly after, he was arrested. You'd think an attempted murder like that would land someone in prison for a long time, but Byron pleaded guilty and received a relatively light sentence. And that's how he ended up in the workhouse with weekend furlough privileges. Let that sink in. He had already shot someone in the street, yet still had the freedom to walk the city on weekends. That decision would prove fatal, because 15 months later, he walked out of jail on another weekend pass, and Angela Clay was about to pay the ultimate price. Sunday night, Angela was back home after visiting her mom. Her daughters were tucked in, the lights were off. The apartment was silent. Angela lay curled under her sheets, sound asleep. LaToya lay beside her, and Lakeisha was in the next room, dreaming like any 6-year-old should. At some point in the middle of the night, Byron stepped through the front door. There were no signs of forced entry, which meant he either had a key or Angela let him in. Either way, once he was inside, he didn't hesitate. He walked quietly into the bedroom. Angela never stirred. Byron raised a revolver. One shot, straight through the top of her skull. She died instantly. No screams, no chance to fight. Just gone. Then he turned to leave, but something made him pause. A noise. A faint sound, maybe a rustle or a gasp. It was LaToya. She had stirred in her sleep. That's all it took. Byron turned back and fired again, hitting her through the chest and neck. She fell, jammed between the bed and the dresser, still alive. Autopsy reports later showed she twitched and struggled for 10 more agonizing minutes. Still not done, Byron walked down the hall to Lakeisha's bedroom. She was already awake, confused, maybe even relieved to see a familiar face. She had no idea this would be the last thing she ever saw. Byron raised the gun again. 2 more shots. One hit her chest, the other near her hip. She didn't die instantly either. She crawled to the floor, dragging herself across the carpet, tiny hands leaving streaks of blood. She collapsed beside her bed, face down. The room went still. 3 lives, gone in minutes. Byron locked the front door and disappeared into the night. Angela's mother, Amelia Bell, knew something was wrong. Her daughter never returned the iron she borrowed. That wasn't like her. She called. No answer. Tried again. Nothing. She sent another daughter to check. The car was in the driveway, but the shades were down. The house was eerily quiet. Still,
Nothing. Finally, Amelia and Lynette drove to the apartment themselves. They knocked. No answer. That's when they called the police. 9:30 p.m. Monday night, officers arrived. They found the doors locked. No signs of a break-in. So one officer removed the screen from a bedroom window and climbed in. He raised his flashlight, and that's when he saw it. A child's body on the floor, blood on the bed. They searched the rest of the apartment and made a horrifying discovery. Angela, shot in the head, still under the sheets. LaToya, wedged between the bed and the dresser, surrounded by blood. And Lakeisha, face down, blood pooled around her. She had lived the longest. Reports say she could have survived up to 30 minutes after being shot. The scene was gruesome. But the evidence? It was damning. Investigators recovered bullets from the walls, the mattress, and the pillows. They found fingerprints on the phone, one on the receiver in the kitchen, two on the base in the hallway. All belonged to Byron Black. And then came the twist no one expected. The bullets used to kill Angela and her daughters matched the exact type used in the 1986 shooting of Benny Clay. The bullet was still lodged inside Benny's shoulder, so detectives asked him to undergo surgery. The bullet was removed. Ballistics experts confirmed it. Same gun. As one detective put it, it was the first time I'd ever recovered key evidence from inside a living person. And just like that, the circle was complete. Byron Lewis Black's conviction marked the beginning of one of the longest stints on Tennessee's death row. While many death row inmates spend years appealing their sentences, few endure the kind of limbo Black experienced. 35 years in a cell, awaiting execution. That alone raises questions, not just about Black's mental state, but about the justice system itself. Death row at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville isn't what Hollywood shows you. There are no dramatic last meals every Friday or non-stop prayer circles. Instead, it's an endless routine. 23 hours a day in a tiny cell, 1 hour of isolated recreation, and no direct contact with others. Black, like most inmates, lived in near total isolation, with only books, paper, and occasional visitors to break the silence. What's surprising is that Black wasn't a model prisoner, but he wasn't a monster behind bars either. According to reports, he remained mostly quiet and reserved, rarely causing problems. He didn't speak to the press, didn't file dramatic last-minute appeals, and didn't reach out for sympathy. Instead, he seemed to fade into the gray background of a broken system, aging year after year while the world outside moved on.
But don't mistake his silence for remorse. Despite the gravity of his crimes, murdering a mother and her 2 daughters, Byron Lewis Black never publicly expressed guilt, and he never took the stand in his own defense. Some believed his silence was a calculated legal strategy. Others thought it revealed something deeper. A man so cold, so detached, that even 35 years on death row couldn't thaw him. Yet behind the scenes, his legal team was far from silent. Over the years, they filed numerous appeals, citing new evidence, Black's mental health, and claims that his conviction had been unfair. One of the most powerful arguments came in the form of a 2014 neuropsychological evaluation. The results were disturbing. Black was reportedly suffering from organic brain damage, cognitive decline, and severe mental illness, including schizoaffective disorder. What does that mean? In simple terms, his brain wasn't functioning like a normal adult's.
His IQ was below average, and he struggled with executive functioning, decision-making, and impulse control. This raised a haunting question. Should a man in this mental condition even be executed? Under U.S. Supreme Court rulings, individuals who are intellectually disabled or severely mentally ill may not be constitutionally eligible for the death penalty. And Black's defense argued exactly that. In fact, they claimed his condition had significantly worsened over the decades, deteriorating to the point where he was no longer capable of understanding his punishment. But the courts didn't agree. Time after time, Black's appeals were denied, not because the evidence wasn't compelling, but because it wasn't compelling enough. The legal system set a high bar, and Byron Black couldn't clear it. By 2022, Byron Black had outlived many of his fellow death row inmates. He was already in his 60s, suffering from diabetes, chronic hypertension, neurological issues, and declining mental health. And yet, the execution date kept getting postponed, pushed back by COVID, administrative errors, and legal debates. Then, in early 2025, something changed. Tennessee's governor announced a renewed commitment to clearing the state's death row backlog. Several death row executions were quietly rescheduled, and Byron Black's name appeared on that list. The countdown had begun, and this time, it was real. In the weeks leading up to his execution, Byron Black remained mostly silent, just like he had for the past 3 decades. But behind those prison walls, preparations were underway for his final moments. River Bend has a small, sterile execution chamber, known for its efficiency and lack of ceremony. There are no cameras, no large crowds, no drawn-out media spectacle. Just a small group of witnesses, medical personnel, and prison staff. On the morning of his scheduled execution in July 2025, Black was given the usual choice, a last meal. Inmates in Tennessee can order anything within reason, as long as it's available in the prison kitchen. Black's last meal was hauntingly simple: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, and a slice of pecan pie. It wasn't extravagant, but it was familiar, a final reminder of comfort, maybe even childhood. Then came the final hours. He was moved to the death watch cell, located just steps away from the execution chamber. Here he was monitored 24/7. Guards watched every move, every breath, every moment. He was allowed to speak with clergy, write a final statement, or request to see family. But according to reports, Black declined most of those offers. He remained largely alone. At 7 p.m., the witnesses were escorted into the observation room. Among them were members of Angela Clay's family, who had waited nearly 40 years for justice. For them, this wasn't closure. It was consequence. Just minutes later, Byron Lewis Black was strapped to the gurney. He did not resist. He did not cry. He did not speak at first. As the IV was inserted and the chemicals prepared, the room held its breath. Then he spoke his last words. "I've made my peace. I'm sorry to those I've hurt. That's all." It was the first time in decades that anyone had heard Byron Black express even a sliver of regret. Some saw it as too little, too late. Others wondered if it was genuine. But either way, those were the words he left behind. At 7:22 p.m., the lethal injection was administered. Within minutes, he was gone. Just like that, a 35-year chapter ended. Byron Black's execution triggered a wave of reactions, not just in Tennessee, but across the country. For the Clay family, it was a moment they had waited a lifetime for. But their public statements were brief. They simply said, "Justice has finally been served. May Angela, Latoya, and Lakeisha finally rest in peace." No cameras, no interviews, just closure. But for others, the case raised more questions than answers. Why did it take 35 years to carry out a sentence? What does that say about America's death penalty system? And if Byron Black was truly suffering from severe mental illness, should he have been executed at all? In the weeks after his death, multiple human rights organizations and mental health advocates released statements condemning the execution. They argued that Black's condition should have exempted him from capital punishment, that the state had executed a man who no longer fully understood what was happening to him. The state, however, disagreed. They maintained that every appeal had been reviewed, every legal box checked, and that justice had finally caught up with a man who committed an unthinkable crime. Still, the debate raged on. Even among death penalty supporters, Byron Black's execution became a case study in the moral complexity of capital punishment. Is it justice or is it vengeance? Does waiting 35 years dull the impact of the sentence or sharpen it? There were no clear answers, only one undeniable truth. 3 lives were taken in 1988, and nothing, not even execution, could bring them back. As the news faded from the headlines, so too did the memory of Byron Black. He was buried quietly, without ceremony, in the state's prison cemetery, where many executed inmates lie beneath small, numbered stones. But for those who followed his case, Byron Lewis Black remains a name that lingers, not because he was famous, but because he was forgotten for so long. And when his name finally reemerged, it was to mark the end of a life that spiraled into darkness, and a justice system that struggled for decades to respond. Byron Lewis Black's story isn't just about one man's monstrous act. It's a story about time, justice, and what happens when the system forgets how to move forward. He sat in a cage for 35 years, a fading shadow of the man who pulled the trigger in 1988. And when the time finally came to face the consequences, he didn't beg, didn't protest, didn't run. He simply whispered an apology and vanished into silence. But the echoes of his crime and the questions it raises will linger far longer. This has been Death Row Diaries. If you found this story compelling, disturbing, or thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe for more untold true crime stories from Death Row. Like the video to help it reach others who want to uncover the dark truths behind justice. Comment your thoughts below. Do you think Byron Lewis Black should have been executed despite his mental health issues? Let us know.